The next talk is by Mark Ayer, Product Manager of IBM QRadar Risk Management on Security Intelligence.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Everybody awake so far? Now, this is a hard time slot. Yeah, I think the two worst time slots are the ones right after lunch and the one right before dinner, right? It's the one right after lunch, everybody just had a bunch of brats and at this conference, beer and whatever else. So I'll do my best to keep you entertained for the next hour or so. So as you mentioned, my name is Mark Ayer. I'm with IBM. I am a product manager, which means that I basically own one of the products in the IBM security portfolio called QRadar Risk Manager. And I'll talk more about my product as well as the other products in a little bit. But basically, what I'm going to do today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, what my background is. Then I have what I call scary stuff. And the scary stuff is, one of the great things about being part of IBM is we have this group of researchers called X-Force. Anybody ever heard of X-Force? Yeah? Yeah, X-Force is a really cool organization. It's a bunch of researchers. I think it's maybe around 100. They're down in Atlanta primarily. And they have, if I could pick my job at IBM, I would probably be one of those guys. Because what they get to do is basically just kind of watch what's going on, watch for the exploits, the vulnerabilities that are coming out. And the really interesting ones, like remember last year, I think it was, when we had Stuxnet, right? It might have been 2 years ago now. This year was Dooku, I think, right? So when Stuxnet came out, they actually were able to capture a copy of it in the wild and bring it into the lab and pick it apart, reverse engineer it, figure out how it worked, and then publish a bunch of data on how it worked and how it spread. So it's just one of the coolest jobs, to be able to do that kind of stuff. So anyway, so what X-Force does is basically they're kind of an independent organization. They do whatever they want to, and they publish their results free of charge. So last week, we published our mid-year report, and I've got some interesting stats out of that I thought I'd start out with, and that's the scary stuff. So I'll talk about those a little bit. Then I'll talk about how you can mitigate some of that scary stuff. And it's not going to be so much of a sales pitch, because I'm not a sales guy. I'm a techie. But I really kind of want to talk about, because a lot of people don't really understand just how much security IBM does, how many products we have, and all the ways you can use it. So I just kind of want to talk about that. I'm going to focus in on a few products that I happen to know really well because I work on them. And so I'm going to talk about that and some real world stories, some of the stuff that we're doing with it, and hopefully you'll find that somewhat interesting. Since we have a relatively, I won't say it's a small crowd, but it's a relatively small crowd. If there are questions throughout, sometimes people will say, well, can you just hold questions till the end, because what I have to present is really, really important, and you guys' questions aren't. Well, I don't feel that way. So if you have questions, please feel free, raise your hands, jump, whatever, and I'd be happy to try to answer your question. If it's something that'll take more than 60 seconds to answer, I may defer it to the end, and we can talk one-on-one. But I'm more than happy to answer questions as we go. All right, so my background. So it's kind of scary to say this, but I'm in my 30th year in this business. And yes, I started young, not quite that young. But I will say that, I was thinking about this morning. One of the very first things that I did, I was in high school. And one of the very first things that we started doing, I was in the computer club. I was a complete and total nerd, and I still am, or geek, whatever, pick your term. And so one of the very first things we did is we wrote a keylogger that basically would, these were back in the days when everybody in the district learned programming on a mini computer system, so with terminals. So I'm dating myself already, right? But we wrote a keylogger which would basically put up a screen that looked exactly like the login screen, and when they would type in their username and password, it would return the generic error message and then log their username and password, and then it would send them to the normal login sequence. So then they would just say, oh, I just must have mistyped it, and then they just sign in. So we wound up with virtually every username and password for everybody in the school, including the teachers. And I'm not going to go any further into what we did with that stuff, but anyway, this was in 9th grade, when I did that. So I've kind of been a hacker most of my life. So I kind of understand some of these challenges maybe more than some others might. But anyway, so I got out of high school, I went to college. It took me 14 years to graduate because I was working full time. And during that period, I was a programmer, so I was a software developer for about 10 years. And that was sort of in the infancy of security. You know, people back then, and maybe even today, you can make the argument that a lot of developers don't think about security until it's after the fact. Well, that was really the case back then. You really just didn't even think about security. So I did that for about 10 years. Then I moved into kind of a consulting type of role. I did support for a while. I was an IT consultant. Went from there. I had my own company for 5 years. I was a CTO there and kind of moved into systems management and security at that point. I was then also an industry analyst. I worked for Enterprise Management Associates for about 4 years in the security area. And at that point, I moved into, I went to work for a little company at the time called BigFix, which got acquired by IBM. So that's how I wound up being part of IBM. So I was an acquired asset, or whatever you want to call it. That was a couple of years ago. And then just this February, I moved from the BigFix group over into Q1 Labs, where I manage this product. So that's my background. I love this picture. So I'm a big Halloween guy, right? So you'll see some Halloween stuff woven into this presentation here and there. So let me talk a little bit real quick about IBM too. So if you think about it, IBM was one of, if not the first company to ever make security software. Because if you think about mainframes, we're talking about like the 1960s. You had to have security in your mainframes, right? So that was kind of the genesis of a lot of the research that IBM has been doing all throughout the years. So we're looking at 40, 50 years maybe of security background. But most people don't think of IBM as a security company because IBM's never really marketed itself that way. And so what happened earlier this year is that somebody up much higher than me got a bright idea and said, well, you know what, we should probably start telling people about what we do, right? So that's where this term security intelligence came from. You got to call it something, right? I don't particularly like security intelligence. It's not bad. You know, you got to call it something, right? So that's where security intelligence came from. And it's just the concept of you need to, you know, if you're a company like IBM, and we literally have hundreds of security assets of products that you can use in lots of different ways, you have to call it something. So that's what security intelligence is. It is a platform, and we are actively working on integrating a lot of those pieces in the platform, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But so I just want to give you a little introduction to, you know, and get you thinking about how IBM really has been involved in a lot of these security innovations over the years. All right, so let's get on to the scary stuff. So as I mentioned, this is stuff that comes out of X-Force, and this report is freely available. You can download it on the web. Just go to ibm.com/security, and you can find the report out there. Before I do that, though, let's talk a little bit about kind of the source of a lot of the exploits and security issues out there. And that is that a lot of people go about their day-to-day existence without ever thinking about security. Now, this shouldn't be a real shock, right? Like my mother, right? My mother is always out surfing the web, and anytime she gets an offer to download some kind of utility, she downloads it, right? So I wind up rebuilding her machine about every 3 months because she's just got something on there that you just can't get rid of, right? And so even those of us that are information security professionals sometimes go about our lives without actively thinking about security. You know, just think about like a USB key, for example. You know, you stick that in your machine, who knows? You know, you might copy confidential stuff on there that could get lost. You know, you might be accidentally infecting a machine. You know, that's how Stuxnet spread, one of the vectors. Right? So the point is, and I love this illustration here, people do their jobs without thinking about security, right? So, yeah, the secret nuclear bunker is this way. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the XForce report. So last year, XForce named 2011 the year of the breach. And that was because of very, very many high visibility, high impact breaches, like the Sony PlayStation debacle comes to mind, right? All these very, very large things. And part of that was the fact that these breaches, you know, the whole profile of these breaches is changing. It used to be, you know, hackers were, you know, like when I was coming up through the ranks, you know, hacks were, a lot of times were for bragging rights. You know, it was college kids, sometimes high school kids, and they just want to basically say, you know what, I could do this, and I'm going to prove this to you because I'm going to deface this website, but I'm not going to really do anything with it. Well, so as we all know, the nature of these breaches is becoming much more serious because there are serious financial gains to be realized from doing that, right? So that's where the term, APT, Advanced Persistent Threats, came from, where you've got these increasingly these very well-funded, highly technical, highly connected teams that are developing malware explicitly for financial gain, right? So that's part of where that came from. And interesting things too, like digital identities. We all preach about passwords and the need of changing passwords and all this sort of thing. Two-factor authentication is becoming more and more commonplace. And there's some really interesting work on more innovative ways of doing two-factor. We've got a presentation later on where where you're going to talk about using your gate, right, to identify you, right? So there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on. But what's happening is because of rapidly advancing social engineering tricks, loose data protection policies, it still is really, really easy to find passwords. I think it was 2 years ago at DEF CON, they had, or might have been 3 years ago, they had a contest where they basically had a cash prize to the team that could crack the most amount of passwords in, I think it was in a 48-hour period. And the winning team, I think it was a pretty good prize, it was like 10 grand or something like that. And if memory serves, the winning team cracked, I think it was 50,000 passwords they had to crack, and they cracked like 40,000 of them. And these were all passwords that were created using industry standard best practices. They weren't just deliberately, some of them were just deliberately easy. These were all kind of, mixed case, symbols, all that kind of stuff. So, I could talk for an hour just on password policies. But the point is that, these attacks are getting much, much more sophisticated. Like this one here that I talked about is really interesting, where they bypassed a two-factor authentication scheme by basically calling up the mobile phone provider and acting stupid, right? And said, well, I forgot my password, can you reset it? So they allowed them to reset their voicemail password, which then allowed them to get into all the voicemail and cull all kinds of interesting data about that individual, which then allowed them to hack into their identity and get their data. So in terms of actual attacks, so SQL injection remains the top web attack technique. That shouldn't be any big surprise. What is really interesting is that we also have Crosssite scripting and directory traversal as separate attacks, but they're also beginning to be used together, right? So here, like over 51% of all the web app vulnerabilities are classified as cross-site, and a lot of them, as I mentioned, are multiples. All right, here comes a neat graph. All right, so in terms of, so what XForce does is they have some really interesting techniques for gathering all this data. One of the techniques I'll talk about in a minute, but it's called, basically we have a Darknet. Everybody know what a Darknet is? Yeah, so Darknet is just a series of inactive IP addresses. There's nothing running on them. There never has been anything running on them because IBM's owned them forever. We have about 25,000 of them if memory serves. And basically, so if someone is poking around inside of that Darknet on those IP addresses, they're up to no good because there'd be no legitimate reason that anybody would ever try to access one of those. So by monitoring that Darknet, we can look at all kinds of interesting things and look at like the signatures and the things that what people are doing. So anyway, from our research, this is showing sort of the top high volume signatures of the exploits that are occurring. We also, of course, being IBM, we also have a huge managed service practice. And a lot of that is managed security. We have security operations centers all over the world. So we manage networks for many, many customers. So we can also leverage the data that's collected, and we do it anonymously, but we can collect that data from those networks, which gives us a really interesting viewpoint into all the exploits and attempted exploits that are out there. So anyway, what you can see here is kind of the list going downward. So as I mentioned, SQL injection is the top one. Interestingly, SQL Slammer is still out there. It's number 2. This just shocked me, because SQL Slammer is like 10 years old now, but it's still out there. And nobody seems to really know why. The only thing I can think of is, again, because there's so many, one of the biggest challenges we all face is keeping machines patched, right? And so you've got machines, you've got a very difficult time sometimes patching machines, and you've got older machines in some cases. Like I was just talking to somebody who said that they just discovered, I think it was a Windows NT. Everybody remember Windows NT? Yeah, me too. So they discovered a Windows NT box running on their network, and nobody had touched it in years. They forgot it was even there. So obviously it hadn't been patched, so that would be a perfect, host for all sorts of malware, right? So I think that may be part of it. It's just older, unpatched machines that people have forgotten about or just, just don't ever update. In any event, so SQL Slammer's still around, although they do say that it's trending down and will probably go away in the next year or so. Then this third one's really interesting, this PS Exec Service Access. It's actually, this is a real tool that Microsoft doesn't sell, I think they give it away. But it's a legitimate system administration tool. Well, what happens, so it basically allows you to remotely execute services on a machine. The problem, of course, is that if you put this on a machine and you can exploit it through a weak password or any variety of ways, you can do anything you want on that machine, right? So, interestingly, a lot of that traffic, of course, could be legitimate, but a lot of it that we're seeing on the open internet is probably people, exploiting it. So that's one thing to look at on your network is see if you can track how many people are using that and if it should be on those machines or not. Then we've got the get ... data exploit. That's one of the directory traversal exploits where basically you can gain access to, through a malform command, you can gain access to all the files that are on a web server by traversing the directory. So that one's pretty popular. And again, sometimes those are combined with the SQL injection and the cross-site scripting. Crosssite's been around for a while. And then the rest of these are kind of down there too. So, the SNMP crack, brute force attacks, and so on. I won't get into the little guys. So this is interesting too. So what we did here is we took a look at the cross-site scripting events, and this is starting last year and going up through June of this year, as well as the SQL injection events, and we sort of plotted a moving average. And this shows that, first of all, they're not going down, they're both going up, plus the slope of both of them is very similar, which tells you that they're both very active, and they're both growing, and they're both growing at about the same rate. And again, part of that may be because they're both being used together in the same exploits. So interestingly, so these are the vulnerability disclosures growth. So in other words, these are the publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. Typically, those will come from independent software vendors and so on. But anyway, in 2011, we were talking about, wow, it's gone down some. It went down from a high of about 9,000 to about 8,000. So maybe 12, 15%. So we were hoping that was going to be a downward trend. Well, it turns out that was just an anomalous year, because it's back up again this year and it looks to be continuing to increase. All right, so this is the growth of obfuscation techniques. Everybody know what that is? I had to read up on it because I wasn't exactly sure what they were talking about. This is malware which is using active obfuscation techniques to disguise itself so that things like IDS and IDP and SIM products don't detect it. So that involves doing things like encrypting itself, using SSL or whatever it might be, so that so it doesn't trigger an alert. And again, so that's growing at a very rapid pace, and those are getting really difficult to detect. Again, that's a lot of what Stuxnet did. It could self-modify itself, it could encrypt part of itself, and it made it really, really hard to track it. If you're just using like signature-based tracking, it's really, really hard to track something that's self-modifying because the signature can always change. So that's a very popular technique. So here's another one that went down last year for a little bit and then it's right back up again. So this is overall vulnerabilities without patches. So these are vulnerabilities that have been discovered, but there is no fix for. And so this is a combination of operating system vendors, application vendors, as well as could be custom developed code as well. But again, so we're showing, that close to 50% of the vulnerabilities out there that have been published do not have patches. Yes, sir. Right, yeah. So they probably wouldn't be in the CVE list. Some of them probably are. But. All right, so let's talk about the Darknet. So I think this is pretty cool. So sometimes they call it a black hole network or a network telescope, and it's really interesting some of the stats that you can get out of this. So we have an aperture, so it's kind of an astronomy term. An aperture of 25,600 addresses have never had anything running on them. So again, if we see traffic on there, it's most likely malicious. So one of the interesting trend is what we call backscatter activity. And so what backscatter is, and again, I think this is another astronomy term, but the idea there is that if you've got like a DOS or DDoS attack that's using spoofing techniques, what will happen, of course, is they modify the packet and they put a bogus IP address in the source of the packet. And so what happens is when the victim receives that, they oftentimes will respond back. And what happens is sometimes those spoofed addresses they're using are addresses that are actually in our Darknet. So that's where the term backscatter comes from, because we're actually getting responses back from these victims in our Darknet because they put our IP address as or one of our IP addresses as the spoofed source IP. So just by monitoring this backscatter traffic, we can see trends in terms of DOS and DDoS attacks. So that's what this graph shows. And this is trending up very fast. And this one just kind of shows the overall accumulation of events. But look at that, over 200 million events in 2011. And this is, and you think about it, backscatter is almost like a random thing. They just happen to pick one of our IP addresses. So this is a very, very small, percentage of the total amount of traffic. All right, so let's talk a little bit about APTs, or advanced persistent threats. So as I mentioned earlier, so these are directed, highly targeted efforts. They're very persistent and long running. So again, if you look at Stuxnet or Duku, which is sort of a spawn of Stuxnet, those were architected to spread very slowly and very cautiously because they didn't want to be detected, right? So the way you do that, is by, like for example, one of the vectors that Stuxnet uses a USB key. And so if it was loaded on a USB key, it would actually keep track of the number of times that it was inserted into a machine and that it copied itself. And I think it was after 10 times, it would destroy itself, remove itself from the drive. Right, so you get basically 10 tries, and then it would go away. So erasing all traces that it was ever on there. So that's one of the really interesting things that's happening is you've got these very stealthy attacks that are happening. And they're designed, it could take months, maybe even years to fully exploit the target. But the fact is that because they kind of fly below the radar, they're very, very difficult to detect. And again, these are created, some of them are created by well-funded, very highly technical people. A lot of times they have connections, inside of like other companies. Like for example, if your victim is company X, one of the techniques they've been using is they'll actually come in and they'll get themselves infiltrated into a business partner of that company. And nowadays, a lot of business partners have connectivity into their partners' networks. And so what they did is they actually got their virus injected into the software distribution mechanism of a partner, and then it used that to replicate itself across to their actual target's network. So really interesting, crazy stuff going on with these. Another example of that was with Stuxnet again. One of the things they did is they infiltrated a software company in Taiwan and actually got copies of their certificates and used those to distribute itself. So it was actually a valid cert and looked like a legitimate piece of software up until the point when it was finally disclosed and they revoked those certs. But again, they literally had to have physical access to that organization to be able to get copies of those certs. right, so even though APTs comprise a small percentage of breaches, the potential business pack is very, very large, right? Because those are going after highly targeted companies looking at very high value assets. So those tactics, as I mentioned, can be infiltration, creating custom malware, which can be spread through a variety of means, including business partners, using the social engineering techniques and so on to compromise user accounts. Lots of interesting things going on in social engineering, of course. Exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities. You know, and a lot of times, what I found is interesting about exploits, too, and this was true with Stuxnet and Dooku as well, a lot of the vectors that it used to spread, they're not 0 days. They're actually vulnerabilities that have been out for quite a while, but nobody ever got around to patching them. Right? So, like, a lot of machines are still vulnerable simply because they just, you know, IT organizations can't get around to patching them for months at a time sometimes. And then communicating over covert channels. So you see a lot of things where you'll see like command and control data going across port 80 and unencrypted. So it just can look like regular old web traffic. So doing lots of interesting covert things that way. So I think this slide's pretty cool because this really talks about some of these targeted attacks. You know, we all probably familiar with the Sony debacle. That was the biggest one. You know, and that was primarily a SQL injection attack. I mean, look at this who's who of folks out there. You know, of course, even RSA got hacked last year. You know, Epsilon was another big one. Nobody really still doesn't really know how that one happened, but it was a huge loss of information. So the point here is that, you know, you've got lots of attacks that are getting larger and larger in terms of potential financial loss or in terms of the number of records disclosed, and yet the attack types are, you know, all over the board. Here's my other Halloween reference. So, but there is some good news. We got the happy jack-o'-lantern. So spam is on the decline. Wow, yay, that's great. One of the reasons for that, of course, is they're getting much more efficient at taking down botnets and that kind of stuff, right? So, so spam is definitely on the decline, although what we find is that, of course, the type of spam is getting a little more clever, and so you can get past filters a little more easily. So vulnerabilities in terms of mobile operating systems really spiked, you know, between 2010 and 2011. They've gone down quite a lot since then. I don't think this is necessarily a trend that's going to continue on the downward, right? Because as we get more and more mobile operating systems out there, more and more variants of Android, for example. I mean, how many variants are there of Android? Hundreds, probably, right? Every carrier with every phone tends, except for Google, tends to fully modify Android, putting different skins on it and different modifications. And every time they do that, of course, they diverge, you know, away from the standard code base, and you open up potential vulnerabilities. So, you know, Android, I think, is the scariest one out there. You know, and then, you know, you've just got the amazing growth of smartphones as well. Just sort of market presence is getting larger and larger every year. So I just can't see that continuing to go down. All right, so let me pause. Any questions before I go on to the rest of it? Most people are still awake, so that's good. Feel free to get yourself a Pepsi or something if you need it. All right, so these are some of the things that we're seeing within our customers. You know, so we've got data explosion, so the age of big data. You know, I remember back in the day when, you know, like I can remember I was working at Computerland when the first hard drive showed up for an Apple computer. And now I've really dated myself, right? That hard drive had 5 megabytes of capacity, and it cost $2,000. I know, it's amazing, isn't it? Today, of course, we could go out and you can buy, you know, an 8 gig memory stick for $2 sometimes, whatever it is, right? It's just phenomenal. You know, so we've got households that have terabytes of data. We've got organizations that have, you know, petabytes and petabytes of data. So big data is huge. And of course, the problem with that is the more data that there is out there, the harder it is to secure it, and the harder it is to track who's accessing it, all that kind of thing. The consumerization of IT. So this was a kind of a funny story. So IBM last year announced that they are going to support consumer or employee-owned devices. So that means if you have your own phone or your iPad or whatever it is, that you can bring it in and you can attach it to the network and so on and so forth. And so what they announced is they were going to do a limited deployment of this. So only certain people within IBM could get access to it. So in IBM scale, how big do you think a limited deployment might be? 5,000? No, 100,000 devices. You win the prize, right? Yeah, you probably work for IBM. Now, 100,000 machines was a limited deployment. But if you think about it, IBM has 440,000 employees and about another 100,000 contractors. So that was, 20% probably of the workforce at IBM. So anyway, so that's happening not just at IBM. If it happens at an old technology company like IBM, it's happening everywhere. And I'm happy that it does, because I can have my iPhone or I can have my Mac and do my work on it. Everything is everywhere, of course, so we've got such a spread of technology. And and corporate data is finding its way out further and further away from the data center. You've got mobile devices, you've got business partners, the networks are becoming much more porous over time, so of course data is just getting everywhere. So we have to figure out how to control that. And then attack sophistication, I've talked about that already. It's the complexity and prevalence of these attacks is increasing. So what's become is IT security used to be sort of one of those things where if there was a CISO, the CISO was responsible for it. But today, especially with all the high visibility losses, it's really become a boardroom discussion. Especially when you start talking about Sony potential $1 billion long-term impact from the PlayStation debacle, $171 million for every 100 customers that lost their data. So when you start talking about billions of dollars, obviously that gets people's attention pretty fast. And we've got very, very large customers, and they're all concerned about this happening to them. So the way we look at it at IBM, there's really kind of 4 categories of things you need to think about. First of all, you've got people involved. And as you probably know, people are probably your #1 security exposure. If you have $100,000 to spend on security, I would say, and that's all you have to spend on it, spend half of that educating your users, and you get a much better return on investment than spending $100,000 on some fancy piece of hardware. Now, some of the guys at IBM probably would not, especially the sales guys, probably would not agree with me on that. But, just educating your users about proper password techniques and data hygiene techniques and all that sort of thing can go a long way to solving issues. So that's one aspect of it. And as far as the people that we have to worry about, that's also exploding. So not only do we have to worry about internal folks, the employees, but you've got all sorts of external people, business partners and consultants. Obviously, we've got hackers, maybe even terrorists. A lot of companies have outsourced, so you have to worry about who's doing your outsourcing. Even customers have access in some cases to your networks. So we've got to think about all those different aspects to it. As far as data, we not only have to worry about structured data, but a lot of your confidential data may be going across as unstructured. And obviously, when it's unstructured, it gets even harder to track. You've got data at rest, which is obviously sitting inside your databases or inside your data center, as well as in motion. So we have to think about that. Where is it being transferred? How is it being transferred? All that sort of thing. On the application side, system, web applications, Web 2.0, which is probably should be called Web 3.0 by now, but anyway, because it's been a while since they coined that term. And mobile applications. And then on the infrastructure side too, all the explosion of different platforms and so on that you need to think about. So the point here is that you can't just protect the perimeter anymore. In fact, a couple of years ago, I was talking to the CISO of the Air Force. And basically, what the Air Force has recognized is that a firewall is no longer is not the perimeter anymore. The perimeter has to be set at the actual device, right? Because the firewalls have to permit so much traffic nowadays. The networks have become so porous that you just can't even think about that as a perimeter anymore. And furthermore, of course, from an IBM perspective, You know, we look at it kind of holistically, if you will, you know, across the board. You know, and so we're looking at how you protect all of this together, not just one piece at a time. All right, so in terms of overall maturity of your security you know, strategy here, you know, most folks start kind of down here in the manual reactive phase. You know, and it's surprising to me even today how many large organizations, much less small ones, are still kind of down here. So that means that you're doing a lot of manual intervention. You know, if you have a SIM product, it's a basic one. You may just be doing log management. Of course, a lot of organizations start at log management and then don't go any further than that. So, you know, as you kind of move up, you can become much more automated, much more proactive. Not only does it give you better security, it also tends to drive your costs down. So here's some of the things and the characteristics, again, spanning these 4 categories that we like to think about. You know, so on the basic side, you know, if you've just got a directory, you're doing a little bit of encryption and access control, you're doing application scanning on your app side, and you're using perimeter security, antivirus, that's kind of what your basic category would include. And I think if we did a survey, you know, maybe of the, you know, Fortune 1000 in the US, you'd find a surprising amount of companies that are still just kind of stuck down here at the basic level. Now, as you move up into the proficient category, that's where we start talking about doing user provisioning and actually doing strong authentication, putting in a SIM, doing some data loss prevention type of stuff, maybe looking at using application firewalls. That's an interesting question. How many of you folks out there are using application layer firewalls today? Okay, that's about right, probably 20, 30%. That's an interesting trend. I'm seeing it a lot in my customer base, but those are typically very, very large organizations and, that are getting into that. And then, you know, virtualization security, asset management, and endpoint and network security management. So proficient is really where we should all at least be at a bare minimum today. And then as you get into optimize, that's when you can get into some really interesting stuff. You know, identity governance, doing privileged user controls and monitoring, you know, various data flow analytics and governance, fraud detection and event network monitoring, and forensics has become increasingly more important as well. So this is kind of the message that we're trying to get across to everybody today. Is, you know what? IBM Security System is the only vendor in the market that can cover all those 4 silos with products that integrate with one another. We've invested nearly $2 billion in technologies, which includes companies like Q1 Labs, which is who I work for now, as well as Big Fix and Guardium and AppScan and some others I'll talk about in a second here. We have 6,000 security consultants and engineers. You know, we have XForce, which I've already talked about, and we have the largest vulnerability database in the industry, which is an output of the XForce group. So how are you going to increase your situational awareness? So, you know, if you think about security kind of as an overall timeline, and I've got a slide coming up that kind of talks about this, but, you know, one of the things is to really get your arms around what's happening right now, which is your situational awareness. Typically that involves using a SIM as well as some of the other products to really understand what's happening on your network today. But one of the things we're really working at and helping our customers work on is getting ahead of the exploit. That is so important. You know, if you can prevent that from happening in the first place, then, you know, obviously you're going to reduce the amount of potential exposure and loss, you know, if you do get breached. So to be able to do that sort of in an integrated way and to make it easy, that's a big part of what we're working on. And if you can do it right, you can actually do that and you can save money at the same time. So in terms of our global coverage, I think this is a kind of interesting slide just because this shows all of our security operations centers. There's one near me. I live in Denver, by the way. So we have a great big one in Boulder, excuse me, Atlanta. So we kind of have worldwide coverage in terms of our research centers and our operations centers. As far as our managed services, so we have over 20,000 devices under contract. And when I say devices, these are primarily security devices. 3,700 clients using our services. We manage over 9 billion events a day through our SOCs. We have over 1,000 security patents. And we have 133 countries that we monitor. All right, so let's talk a little bit about specific examples here. So this is a real marketing slide here, but I think it's kind of cool, right? So take these various tiers, and it all kind of flows up into this thing that we call a smarter planet. Okay, enough marketing slides. So, you know, one of the biggest challenges that I see out there is that there's so much data and there's so many different silos of data, is how do you get that all in one place so that you can actually do something with it? So that includes everything from, you know, network activity, virtual machines, change in config, you know, applications, servers, security, and user activity. So you need to be able to get that together in one place so that you can run analytics on it. And what we do is, so we do that, of course, I'm talking mostly about our SIM product here. So we can bring in all those types of things, and what we do is we boil all that down into what we call an offense. Okay? And an offense is the result of not only collecting all of this data. You know, lots of SIMs are really good at collecting data. Not so many SIMs are so good at actually creating actionable information from all that data that they've collected. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that have many, you know, multiple $million-dollar investments in SIMs, and yet they still can't get the data that they want to out of it. So we spend a lot of time and a lot of money just investing in how you go about doing that. So here's kind of how we split the timeline. If you start, you know, in the center here at the exploit, so, you know, traditional SIM products kind of focus on the right side here. So it's all about knowing what's happening, excuse me, what's happening on your network and figuring out how to stop what's going on, which is good. I mean, you need that kind of stuff. You need SIM products and DLP and all that to be able to do that. But you also need to be able to get ahead of the curve here. So really get your arms around which of your systems are vulnerable, how are they vulnerable, and are they at risk of being exploited? Because that's really what you want to be able to do. I think the holy grail is to be able to not only know which of your machines are vulnerable, but also which one should you fix first. Right? Because that's a problem. Right now you may have invested in one or more vulnerability scanners. And so you can actually scan all your machines, and you can tell how many of those are vulnerable to exploit. But at the end of the day, if you've got 1,000 or 10,000 or more machines that need to be fixed, which ones do you need to fix first? Because if you think about it, if you can fix 10 machines that are, you know, have a valuable, or not a valuable, but have an actual vulnerable exploit, and can be exploited because they have a valid attack path either from the network, from the internet, or from a business partner. If you fix those 10 machines, then they're not going to infect all the other machines that they're connected to. Right? So it's kind of like a domino effect. So that's really one of the things that we're looking at, is figuring out the best way to be able to identify those machines and then actually remediate those machines very quickly. Now, I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, I put this slide up just because it's kind of an eye chart, you know, but if you think about it, these are all of the products that IBM has in these various tiers. I'm not going to go through every one of these. But for me, this was kind of an epiphany, because I had no idea that, until I saw this slide, how many different products IBM actually has in the security area. I'm going to call out a few just because they're the ones that I know really well. Of course, there's the QRadar SIM, which I work on. This is my product here, the QRadar Risk Manager. We have a very good GRC platform up here called Open Pages. Guardium is an excellent database security tool. Basically, it tracks database activity and allows you to enforce policy around that. AppScan is a vulnerability scanner that can scan source code as well as applications that are in process or in production, or, you know, available from the internet. And then we have BigFix, which is a very good, you know, endpoint patch management configuration tool. So one of the things we're doing at IBM, this looks like the exact same slide, but I've got some builds. I should have put them together, but I didn't. So one of the things we're doing is we're working on, first of all, integrating all of these together so you can start doing some really interesting things. A good use case for that, if you look at the QRadar and BigFix integration that we just did. So we have a lot of customers that have invested in QRadar, and these are the 4 products that comprise that. So QRadar, of course, is a SIM product and also a risk management product. So it's really good at taking in, I've got 10 minutes, thank you. It's really good at taking in lots of data, but there's a couple things it doesn't do. One thing is it has a hard time getting vulnerability data from like workstations, like Windows machines and servers and that kind of stuff, right? And it also doesn't have the capability and wasn't architected to do any sort of remediation, right? Because that's what other tools do. So what we're looking at doing, not looking, we just actually did some, is we are integrating QRadar at an operational level with a number of these products. And I'll talk about the BigFix QRadar integration. So in about a week, we're going to release the first version of this integration. And basically, so BigFix is a tool that you can have out on your machines to do patch management, power management, software asset management, all sorts of things. And it has this really cool agent. And this agent can tell you almost anything you might want to know about that machine. So we've built an integration between BigFix and QRadar so that the state of these endpoints can be pushed up from BigFix into QRadar. So examples of this could be things like virus infections, right? So we can pick data off of that's being sent up that indicates which machines have active virus infections, forward that up into QRadar. QRadar, being a SIM, can then correlate that with network activity. Okay? We're also going to be able to pass vulnerabilities from all those machines up. So we're not talking about the output of a vulnerability scanner. We're talking about an actual agent on that machine that can query any property you might want on that to determine if it's vulnerable or not. So this isn't just patches, it's configurations, it could be any number of things. So again, push that up into a SIM and do some advanced correlation on it, and it starts to get really, really interesting. Combine that with our capability of understanding the network topology. Now you've got vulnerability data coming up from the endpoint, coming into the SIM. The SIM can then correlate that with both network activity as well as the network topology, can give you a subset of those devices that are vulnerable, that are ones that are at high risk of being exploited. Because we can figure out which of those machines have attack paths and are actually vulnerable to an attack. We can then pass that back down to BigFix, and BigFix could then use that to remediate those vulnerabilities. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going with this, is being able to do some closed loop type of remediation. So that you discover a vulnerability, you report it up, you do a correlation, you push it back down and remediate it very quickly. Okay. All right, so let me talk just about a few examples here of some of the cool stuff that we've done. So in one case, this is a customer where they had a competing SIM product, and we put it in, and we found 500 hosts that had a virus that every other security product that they had installed missed. Chevron's a really cool example. They had 2 billion login events that, with a competitive product, was generating thousands and thousands of whatever they call offenses in that system. And they couldn't do anything with it because there was just too many. So we were able to reduce that down to 25 per day out of that quantity. Okay, another thing that we've got going on is the consumerization of IT and the mobile device management side. So that's, of course, become a really big focus lately, the ability to incorporate the management of all your mobile devices. So that's regardless of vendor, if it's Android or if it's Apple or Nokia, whatever it might be, and be able to integrate that back into your overall security strategy without having to use yet another point product. So through the BigFix, which by the way is also known as IBM Endpoint Manager, I always call it BigFix, I came from them. But that product has a really nice mobile device management capability now, which again allows you to use the same tool you would use for patching your Windows machines or your Unix machines to also manage your mobile devices. So I put this slide up mainly because it's kind of fun to talk about IBM's own deployment of our own technology. One of the things that's really cool, I used to work for a competing vendor of IBM's, and I won't name them, but basically they're a management vendor. And at one point, I met the CIO of the company. This is a fairly large company, $1 billion in revenue. and I met the CIO, and I said, so I'm really interested, because I would really like to tell our customers how many of our own products we're using internally. And he goes, don't ask that question. I said, okay, maybe I need to find somebody else to work for. So anyway, IBM, fortunately, we do eat our own dog food. We do use our own products. And one good example is after they bought BigFix, 6 months after the acquisition of BigFix, we had deployed the product to 400,000 machines, which was virtually all of the primary workstations in the entire company. Today, it's actually closer to 700,000 because we've also folded in servers and mobile devices and all sorts of other things. So that was really cool. And to be able to do that size of company in less than 6 months was really impressive. What I think is even more impressive were the cost savings, which isn't on this slide, but literally it's millions of dollars in IT labor saved by doing that. And I'm running a little short on time, so I'm just going to skip right ahead here. So, okay. Well, I hope you found this interesting. Any questions? Well, I will be here the rest of today and tomorrow. You know, our booth is over in the corner there. Please feel free to drop by if you have any questions, you want to talk about any specific products or anything like that. And I thank you for your time.